The signal came in at 3:47 in the morning, and it was the 43rd dead civilization I had cataloged that year. I did not feel anything when I read it. That was the part that scared me most looking back. 11 years of deep space survey work had made the extinction of entire species feel like a line in a spreadsheet. I remember sitting at my console aboard the research vessel Lacuna, one hand around a cold cup of coffee, reading the final broadcast of a species that had once built cities on 17 planets, and thinking only about whether I had submitted my previous report on time. My name is Yael Osman. I'm a xenolinguist. My job is to listen to what the dead left behind, translate it into something the living can understand, and then file a report that most people never read. I was good at my job. I was too good at it. I had learned how to stay distant from the material the way you learn to stay distant from anything that would break you if you let it get close. But that morning, something made me stop. It was not the content of the signal. It was the shape of it. The Veth, the species whose final broadcast I was cataloging, had died 40,000 years ago. They had been a carbon-based civilization roughly as old as humanity is now, living on a cluster of worlds in what we call the Lyra Reach. Their final transmission had been sent on every available frequency, full power, pointed outward in all directions. Standard extinction era behavior. Civilizations near the end often broadcast desperately. It was not unusual. What was unusual was that I had seen this exact pattern before. Not similar. Identical. The same structural shape. A countdown sequence, a directional coordinate, and then a single phrase repeated until the signal degraded and died. I had seen it in the Humeric archive 6 months earlier. I had seen it in the Serret ruins the year before that. And now here it was again, in the Veth record, down to the same rhythmic repetition, the same frequency spread, the same final gesture of a civilization pointing at something and screaming in whatever language it had. I pulled up every final broadcast I had cataloged over 11 years. 43 civilizations. I lined them up side by side and looked at them the way you look at a city from above when you finally see the pattern in the streets that you could never see from inside them. Every single one of them had done this. Every last civilization, no matter what it breathed or how it thought or how long it had existed, had used its final hours to transmit the same structural message. The countdown, the direction, the repeated phrase. My hands were steady when I began the cross-analysis. That was the training. Stay steady. Observe. Record. By the time the sun came up over the ship's viewport, I had a preliminary finding I did not want to have. The directional coordinates in all 43 transmissions, when corrected for stellar drift over their respective time periods, converged on the same region of space. A cone-shaped volume. A direction. A place they were all pointing toward. I ran the calculation 3 times. My model was not wrong. Every dead civilization in my dataset had spent its final moments pointing at the same place and screaming the same thing. I pulled up my best translation models and ran the repeated phrase through every xenolinguistic framework I had. The Veth language was partially decoded. The Humeric had been studied for 30 years. The Serret script was still mostly theoretical, but the phrase was short enough and repeated enough that the models could work with it, and what they returned was not a word so much as a classification. A category. My models flagged the emotional valence of the phrase as warning. The grammatical structure identified it as a proper noun. The semantic field, when mapped across all 3 partially decoded languages simultaneously, kept returning the same cluster of meaning. Predator. Dormant. Aware. I sat with that for a long time. Then I did what any careful scientist does when she finds a result that frightens her. I checked her work. I reran every calculation. I looked for errors in my translation models. I searched for coincidence, for confirmation bias, for the kind of pattern seeking that the human brain does automatically when it is tired and anxious at 4 in the morning. I did not find any errors. I found more data. Because when I looked closer at the directional coordinate, the place all 43 civilizations had been pointing at in their final moments, I realized I needed to correct not just for stellar drift, but for the age of the signals and the movement of the galactic arm. When I did that, the cone did not point at empty space. It pointed here. It pointed at us, at the solar system, at Earth. Every vanished race, in its final moment of existence, had used its last breath to warn something. And that something, when you trace the geometry across 40,000 years of stellar movement, was us. I filed a preliminary report. I attached all my data. I flagged it as high priority. I included the coordinate analysis and 3 independent verification runs. I wrote a cover note that was, in retrospect, far too calm for what I was describing. The council classified it within 6 hours. I received a polite message from a deputy administrator telling me the pattern was likely coincidental, that I should continue my survey work. The message was signed by someone whose name I did not recognize, which meant it had been written by someone who did not want their real name on it. I kept a copy of everything. I always keep copies. That is also the training. I could not sleep. I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling of the lacuna and thought about what it meant for a species to spend its last moments warning someone else. Not saving itself. Not recording its history or its art or its science. Warning. Pointing outward into the dark and screaming a word that meant predator, dormant, aware, in a direction that 40,000 years later turned out to be Earth. I thought about the word dormant. Not gone. Not finished. Dormant. Like something sleeping. Like something that could wake up. I got out of my bunk and went back to my console. I pulled up Earth's own signal history. Everything we had ever broadcast. How far it had traveled. What it would look like from outside. What picture it painted of us, strung across the decades like lights left on in a window at night. I sat there for a long time looking at it. All that light. All those signals. All that noise we had been making since the first radio waves left the planet. Spreading outward into space at the speed of light. Carrying our music and our arguments and our news bulletins and our war reports and our love stories out into the dark where anything old enough and patient enough and quiet enough could be listening. I thought about the word dormant again. I thought about what woke things up. Then I closed my files, picked up a fresh coffee, and started writing the message I would send to a network of researchers I had been told not to contact, about a pattern I had been told to forget, involving a coordinate I had been told was coincidental. The council was wrong. I was certain of it the way you're certain of something when every calculation you run keeps giving you the same answer, and the only alternative is to believe that 43 separate civilizations, across 40,000 years of separate history, all independently decided to point at the same empty patch of sky and scream. The universe does not do that by accident. Something was out there. Something that had been here before we were, and had left, or waited, or slept, and every species that found out about it had died shortly after, and had used its very last moment of existence not to mourn itself, but to warn whatever came next. We were whatever came next. I pressed send on the message. Then I sat back and waited. Outside the viewport, the stars were very bright and very still, the way they always are, the way they have always been, utterly patient, giving nothing away. The response from the network came back in pieces from 6 different people in 3 different countries, using 3 different relay servers, all within 48 hours of my message. That told me something important. They had been waiting, not for me specifically, but for someone like me, someone who had run the numbers and arrived at the same place they had and was willing to say it out loud. The first name I learned was Owen Garrett, a signal theorist at a private research station in northern Canada who had been working on the Humeric archive for 9 years. He was the one who wrote back first. His message was short and precise and had the feeling of someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a long time and was grateful to set it down. He wrote, "I decoded part of the Humeric phrase 3 years ago. I submitted the finding and was told to revise it. I revised it 4 times. Each revision made it less accurate. I kept the original. I think you should see it." He attached a file. I opened it. The Humeric phrase, in the original translation before the revisions, read, "We found the ones who hunt between migrations. We made ourselves known to them. Do not make yourself known. The ones who sleep are patient. They are already here." I read it twice. Then I read it again. Not because I did not understand it, because I understood it too well and needed a moment before I could continue. The second name was Clara Dow, a xenoarchaeologist who had been mapping Serret ruins on a moon in the outer belt for 6 years. She sent me 3 files without any message at all, just the files. The first was a raw Serret glyph sequence from a wall panel found in what appeared to be a communications chamber. The second was her translation. The third was the translation the official survey report had published. The differences between the second and third files were significant. The official version described the glyph sequence as a memorial inscription. Clara's version, which was longer and more technically detailed and had clearly taken years of work, described it as something else entirely. A warning. Specifically, we thought they were gods. They are not gods. They are very old, and they are patient, and they have been watching since before our first word was spoken. Run if you can. Warn if you cannot run. We could do neither in the end. Forgive us. The third message came from a man named Peter Aiken, who described himself only as a former government analyst. He did not explain which government. His message contained a single sentence. The coordinate you found is not empty space. There's a structure there. We have known about it for 11 years. Ask me what kind of structure. I asked him what kind of structure. He wrote back, the listening kind. The network grew over the following weeks. I was still aboard the Lacuna, still technically running my survey, still filing the routine reports that kept the council satisfied I was doing my assigned work. In the evenings, after my shift, I worked with Owen and Clara and Peter and the others, feeding everything we had into a translation engine that Peter called Elegy, which he had built himself over 8 years using cross-reference data from 14 separate extinct civilizations. Elegy was not like the official translation tools. The official tools were built to find simple meanings, broad strokes, safe interpretations. Elegy was built to find the meaning behind the meaning, the thing a language was trying to say when it was saying something else, the emotional shape underneath the grammatical structure. Owen called it a grief engine. He was not entirely joking. With enough shared data from enough civilizations, Elegy began to find connections that no single civilization analysis could find. Grammatical structures that repeated across species who had never met each other. Emotional valence patterns that appeared in Veth and Serit and Humeric and 12 others, pointing at the same concept from different directions the way rivers from different mountains all point toward the sea. The concept they kept pointing at did not have a name in any human language. Elegy described it in output as entity, apex, non-migratory, temporally extended, patient, present. Patient, present, not out there somewhere. Here, somewhere in the solar system, in the dark between the planets, in the cold, quiet spaces where nothing moved and nothing was watched, something had been sitting still for a very long time. We were 3 weeks into the analysis when Elegy produced its first full translation of the Veth warning. Not a partial decode, a complete, cross-referenced, multi-source verified translation of what 43 civilizations had spent their last moments trying to say. Owen sent it to me at 2 in the morning his time. He did not add any message. He did not need to. The Veth warning, in full, read, "We reached the stars, and we were not alone, and we were glad. We searched, and we found traces, and we followed them, and we found the source. We spoke to the dark, and the dark listened, and then the dark looked at us, and we understood what we had done. There is a thing that waits. It has always waited. It waited before the first fire on our first world. It will wait after the last fire on the last world. It does not hunt. It does not chase. It waits until you are enough. Until you are large enough to feed it and small enough not to fight it. We were enough. We are sorry. We are telling you this because we have no other way to undo it. Do not become enough. Do not reach out. Do not signal. Do not become visible. It is already watching. It has been watching you since your beginning. We are sorry. We are sorry. We are sorry." The message ended there. The Veth civilization had ended approximately 400 years after that final broadcast. I sat in my chair for a long time without moving. Outside my viewport, the stars were exactly as they had always been. Bright, still, patient. I thought about every signal humanity had ever sent into space. Every radio wave, every television broadcast, every deliberate transmission aimed at the stars. I thought about how far they had traveled, how much of the galaxy was now illuminated, faintly, by the light of human noise, by our presence. I thought about the word enough. Then I thought about something else, something that had been at the back of my mind since I first read Owen's translation of the Humeric phrase, the part that did not quite fit the shape of the others. A small grammatical structure that Elegy had flagged and then set aside because it did not match the dominant pattern of the message. I went back to the raw Humeric data. I asked Elegy to analyze the flag structure independently, outside the context of the rest of the message. Elegy returned its analysis in 4 seconds. The flag structure was a question. not a rhetorical question. A genuine, open-ended question, grammatically marked as unanswered, directed outward, not part of the warning, but appended to it the way you might write a note at the bottom of a letter after you have already sealed it and then changed your mind and opened it again. The humoric question, appended to their final warning, translated as, "What are you?" Not directed at the predator, not directed at the thing in the dark, directed at whoever would receive the warning, directed at whoever came next. "Were you?" I forwarded the find to Owen. He was quiet for a long time. Then he wrote back. Every culture left a warning, but the humoric also left a question. Why? I did not have an answer, but I had a feeling, the kind of feeling that is not comfortable to have, the kind that settles into your chest and stays there, that the question was important. That somewhere in the gap between the warning and the question was the thing we actually needed to find. 3 days later, Clara sent a message that made the gap smaller. She had gone back through every ruin she had ever surveyed and pulled every piece of final communication she could find, and she had looked not for the warnings but for the anomalies, the parts that did not fit, the footnotes, the afterthoughts. She found 6 of them, 6 civilizations that had appended something to their warnings that did not match the rest of the message. In each case, the appended material was different. But when Clara fed all 6 into Elegy and asked it to find the common thread, Elegy produced one word. The word did not translate cleanly. Elegy described it as a concept, hesitation, a pause, an interruption of expected behavior, a moment in a sequence where the next step did not happen when it should have. 6 civilizations, across thousands of years of separate history, had noticed a hesitation. Something that should have happened after they were found, the sequence they all described as inevitable, had paused. Something had made the thing in the dark stop. They did not know why. None of them had survived long enough to find out. But they had noticed, and they had written it down. And they had appended it to their warnings the way you append something important that you do not understand but cannot leave out. I looked at the data for a long time. I thought about what could make something patient enough to wait for 40,000 years pause, even briefly. Then Peter sent a new message. Not to the group, just to me. It said, "There is something you need to see in person. It is on Mars. I can get you clearance. It will change everything you think you know about how long we have been watched and why we are still here." I accepted before I finished reading the message. The thing about Mars is that it looks exactly like you expect it to, which makes the things that should not be there feel even more wrong. The red dust, the low flat light, the absolute quiet that the suit filters cannot quite hide. You get used to it in the first hour, and then you stop thinking about the surface and start thinking about what is underneath it, which is where the important things always turn out to be. Peter met me at the research hub outside Hellas Planitia. He was a compact, careful man in his 50s with the kind of eyes that have looked at too many classified files and learned to give nothing away. He shook my hand and handed me a sealed briefing tablet and said, very quietly, "Read it on the transport. Don't take notes. Everything you read on that tablet stays in your head." I read it on the transport. The facility they called the museum had been discovered 22 years ago by a survey team drilling for subsurface water ice. They had found something else instead. A chamber, roughly 40 meters across, sealed, non Martian in origin, constructed using materials and techniques that matched nothing in any human engineering database. Inside the chamber was a collection. That was the word used in the briefing. A collection. The word was careful and neutral and did not do anything close to justice to what I saw when Peter walked me through the airlock and into the space that 37 people in the entire world had ever been allowed to enter. The walls were covered in panels. Each panel held a record, a dossier, a collection of observations, measurements, and notations so thorough and so precise that it took me several minutes to understand what I was actually looking at. They were records about us, about humanity. Every panel on every wall covered a different period of human development. The oldest panels, which the team's archaeologists had dated to roughly 200,000 years ago, showed anatomical observations. Body structure, brain size, tool use. The middle panels showed settlement patterns, agricultural spread, the growth of language, the development of social structures. The later panels, closer to the present, showed technological development. Writing, navigation, industry, communication, 40 meters of walls, covered floor to ceiling, all of it about us. A file on the human species, maintained across 200,000 years by something that had been watching since before we had words. I walked along the walls slowly. Peter walked beside me and did not speak. There was nothing useful to say. Near the far end of the chamber, the panels changed. The notation style shifted. Something in the way the information was organized became different, less systematic, less purely observational. The entries from the last 300 years had a quality I could not immediately name, and it took me several panels to understand what I was seeing. They were uncertain. After 200,000 years of confident, systematic observation, something in the last 300 years had introduced a variable the record keeper had not anticipated. The annotations became denser. The same data points were re-examined multiple times. There were structures in the notation that Elegy, when I sent Clara a description later, identified as question markers. The last entry was a single glyph. It matched the repeated phrase from the warnings, the proper noun that meant predator, dormant, aware. But this time it stood alone, and after was a mark that Elegy identified as a question. The thing that had been watching us for 200,000 years had, in its last entry, looked at all the data it had collected and asked itself a question about us. What does the question mark mean? I asked Peter. Our best analysis, he said, is uncertainty. It is not certain what we are. Why not? It has had 200,000 years of data. Yes, Peter said, and somewhere in the last 300 years, something in that data stopped fitting its model. He led me to a separate room off the main chamber. Smaller. One table, 2 chairs, a display screen. On the screen was a map of the outer solar system, and scattered across it like seeds on still water were small blinking points. Probes, Peter said, non-human, passive observation units. We found the first one in the orbit of Jupiter in 1987. We have since found 47 more. They are scattered through the outer solar system, pointed inward. They are old. The oldest we have dated at approximately 80,000 years. They have been watching the inner solar system for as long as some human civilizations have existed. I looked at the map. 47 probes, all pointed at Earth. They stopped transmitting 300 years ago, Peter said. All of them. Same time as the last museum entry. They went silent simultaneously. Because something changed, I said. Yes. Us. Yes. Something about us in the last 300 years caused the observer to pause, to reconsider. We call it the hesitation. We do not know what triggered it. We have theories. What are the theories? Peter sat down. He gestured for me to sit as well. He looked like a man who had been carrying a question for a long time and had not yet decided whether the answer would be better or worse than the not knowing. The Industrial Revolution, he said. The rate of technological acceleration. The development of nuclear capability. Any or all of these could represent the threshold. The point at which a civilization becomes enough to matter to the observer. He paused. But none of these theories fully account for the timing. Because other civilizations also reached equivalent thresholds, and none of them produced a hesitation. They were simply collected. Then what is different about us? Peter looked at me for a long moment. That is what you are here to help us figure out, he said. He placed a second tablet on the table. This one is not sealed. We have been modeling the hesitation for 12 years, he said. We have brought in specialists from 11 disciplines. We have compared every data point in the museum against the developmental records of every other civilization we have evidence of. We have run more simulations than I can count, and we keep arriving at the same short list of anomalies. Factors present in human development that were not present in any of the other cataloged civilizations. I picked up the tablet. I scrolled through the short list. It was not what I expected. There was nothing on the list about our technology. Nothing about our weapons, our military capability, our rate of scientific advancement. All the things a strategist might think would make a predator pause were absent from the short list entirely. What was on the list was stranger. Stranger and more specific, and somehow, the more I read, more recognizable. The first anomaly, the extraordinary volume of human cultural production depicting civilization ending catastrophe, alien contact, and existential threat, produced not in response to actual events, but as deliberate imaginative exercise across every culture and every historical period. The second anomaly, The development and widespread adoption of gaming, simulation, and scenario planning as entertainment, resulting in a population that had voluntarily rehearsed survival scenarios billions of times. The third anomaly, the human tendency not to flee from existential knowledge, but to seek it, to look for threats before they arrived, to build fictional versions of disasters, and then study those fictions for strategic lessons. I stopped scrolling. I thought about every story I had ever read about alien invasion, every simulation I had ever heard of where human teams planned responses to extinction-level events. Every game, every film, every book, every thought experiment that asked, what do we do when something comes for us? I thought about how many times collectively, as a species, we had rehearsed for exactly this. We have been practicing, I said. Yes, Peter said, without knowing what we were practicing for. Yes. The room was very quiet. Outside, Mars was exactly as indifferent as it always is. But inside the room, something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel the pressure change before a storm, the atmosphere rearranging itself around something that is about to happen. The observer saw this, I said. It was watching us run the simulations, watching us write the stories, watching us build the games and the plans and the scenarios. And it did not understand why a prey species would voluntarily rehearse being hunted. We believe so, Peter said, and that is what caused the hesitation. That is our best current theory. I set the tablet down. I looked at the map of the solar system with its 47 silent probes, all pointed inward, all watching, all quiet for 300 years. You brought me here because you need a decision, I said. Yes. You want to know whether to make contact. Some members of the task force want to signal directly. Others want to maintain silence. One faction wants to do something else entirely. Peter looked at the map. The observer's question is still unanswered. The question mark in the last museum entry. It asked itself something about us and has been waiting, apparently, for the answer. And the something else entirely, I said carefully. What does that faction want to do? Peter looked at me. They want to answer the question, not to the observer. They want to answer it to the whole planet. Tell everyone. Let humanity respond as humanity, not as a government or a committee, but as a species that has, apparently, been preparing for this without knowing it. I thought about that for a long time. Then a signal came through on Peter's communication unit. He looked at it. His face changed. Something just entered the inner solar system, he said. It did not come from the direction of the probes. He turned the display to face me. A signal. New. Clean. Precise. Coming from somewhere between the orbit of Mars and the asteroid belt. Not old. Not passive. Active and recent and pointed directly at us. Not the thing in the dark. Something else entirely. Something that had been hiding and had just decided to stop. The signal spoke in 17 languages simultaneously. Not human languages. Not the languages of any extinct civilization in my database. But Elegy recognized the underlying grammatical structure immediately because it had seen it before in fragments, in the margins of extinction-era records, in the footnotes of the files that official surveys had dismissed as background noise. Peter and I were still in the small room when the translation came through. Owen had been running the signal through Elegy from his station in Canada the moment the data reached the network, which was about 40 seconds after it reached the task force, because Clara had given him access to an observer relay 3 months ago for exactly this kind of emergency. The translation came through on my personal communicator. Owen had sent it to me directly before he sent it to anyone else, because I think he knew I needed to read it first and have a moment alone with it before the world came in. The message said, "We are the last of the architects of quiet. We have been watching you for 200 years. We came to warn you. We find that we are also afraid of you. We would like to speak, if you are willing. We have not spoken to anyone in a very long time." I read it 3 times. Then I walked back into the main chamber, past the panels that covered 200,000 years of human history, and I stood in front of the last entry, the single glyph with the question mark after it, and I thought about what it meant for something to be afraid of us. Not the predator, that I could understand in a cold, theoretical way. The thing in the dark had paused, had hesitated, had looked at humanity, and found something that did not fit its model. That was the hesitation. That was the anomaly. But the architects of quiet were different. They had survived. Where every other species had died, They had lived and the method of their survival, as Peter explained it to me while the task force scrambled around us, and the signal continued broadcasting in 17 languages, was the most extraordinary thing I had heard in 11 years of cataloging extraordinary things. They had learned to look like nothing, not to hide in the traditional sense, not to go underground or go dark or go silent. They had developed, over thousands of years of research and development, a way of existing that the predator's observation systems simply could not register. They had learned the exact parameters of what the thing in the dark could see and hear and sense, and they had shaped their entire civilization to fall just below every single threshold. They became, in every measurable way, absent, invisible, the background noise of the universe. They had survived by becoming nothing, and they had maintained that nothingness for so long that most of them had forgotten there was anything else to be. But some of them had kept watching, and what they had watched for 200 years was us. The communication came through a relay they had placed in the asteroid belt during the early 20th century. In the same decade, we first learned to split the atom and first began to genuinely worry about our own extinction for the first time in our history. The timing was not coincidental. The architects had noticed something that same year and had begun paying closer attention. Peter arranged the communication channel within 6 hours. The task force's language division worked with Elegy to build a real-time translation bridge. It was not perfect. A lot was lost. A lot had to be inferred. But what came through, over the following 10 hours of slow, careful, cross-reference communication with a last surviving member of a species that had learned to vanish, was enough. The architect communicated through Elegy not as sound or light, but as structured data, dense packets of meaning that Elegy parsed into approximate English. Its designation for itself was something that translated roughly as the one who stayed awake. All the others of its kind had chosen the deepest form of their invisibility, which was a kind of suspension, a long and patient quiet. This one had remained active, had watched, had kept the records that the others had stopped keeping. I asked it why it had stayed awake when the others had chosen quiet. It answered after a pause that lasted 4 minutes. The pause, Elegy noted, was not processing time. It was something the architect's grammar marked as consideration, the pause of someone deciding how honest to be. The answer came as a series of structured concepts that Elegy assembled into English with significant uncertainty flags. The rough meaning was, because something was happening here that had never happened before, and I did not want to miss it. That thing, the unprecedented thing, was us. The architect had been studying humanity the way Owens studied dead signals, the way Clara studied ruins, the way I had spent 11 years cataloging extinctions. Carefully, systematically, with growing fascination and, it admitted, growing unease. It explained the predator to us in terms cleaner and more precise than anything in the museum records, because the architects had spent longer studying it than any other surviving source. The predator was not a single entity in the way we imagine predators. It was old in a way that made the 40,000 years of extinction records feel like a brief afternoon. It had been present in this region of the galaxy since before most of the stars visible from Earth had formed. It did not chase. It did not seek. It set parameters, thresholds of development and visibility and complexity, and it waited for civilizations to reach those parameters, and then it applied pressure, and civilizations collapsed, and it moved its attention elsewhere, and it waited again. It had never, in the architect's records, hesitated before. It had hesitated for us. The architect explained why in a message that took nearly an hour to transmit, because the concepts required so much qualification and cross-referencing that Elegy had to build 3 new translation matrices on the fly to handle them. Every civilization the predator had encountered had, when it reached the threshold of visibility, responded in one of a small number of predictable ways. They fled. They submitted. They attempted to negotiate. They developed weapons and were overwhelmed. In every case, the response was reactive. The civilization discovered the threat and then responded to it. Humanity had done something that did not fit any of these categories. Humanity had, for hundreds of years before discovering the threat, before knowing anything about the predator or the hesitation or the warnings left by 43 dead civilizations, been actively and enthusiastically simulating the threat. Not this specific threat, not the predator specifically, but the category, the scenario of intelligent, capable, potentially hostile contact with something from outside the human experience. Something enormous and patient and not interested in human survival. We had written it in 10,000 stories. We had modeled it in simulations and games and thought experiments. We had built fictional civilizations that faced exactly this kind of scenario, and then we had analyzed those fictions for lessons and applied those lessons to real planning, which we had encoded in real documents, which real organizations had turned into real preparation frameworks. The architects had accessed all of it. 200 years of human cultural production, the part that dealt with existential and civilizational threat, was, to the architect, the most extraordinary thing it had ever encountered. Because no prey species did this. No other civilization in the architect's records had ever rehearsed being hunted. They had not known to rehearse it, and even if they had known, they would not have made it into entertainment. They would not have made it into games that billions of people played for enjoyment and then argued about, and then played again differently to see if different choices led to better outcomes. The predator's observation models had no framework for a prey species that appeared to enjoy simulating its own potential extinction, that found the scenario engaging rather than paralyzing, that kept returning to it voluntarily, refining its simulated responses, building more detailed and more sophisticated fictional versions of the threat over generations, as if sharpening a skill that something deep in the collective human mind suspected might one day be necessary. The predator had flagged this as an anomaly. It had run its models. The models had, as the architect phrased it with a precision that Elegy translated carefully, collapsed. The predator had no prediction for what humanity would do when it reached the threshold. Every other species was predictable at the threshold. Humanity was not. The architect's message about this arrived late in the second hour of communication. Elegy flagged the emotional valence of the message as something it had only seen in one other context. The footnotes that civilizations appended to their warnings. The anomalies. The hesitations. The parts that did not fit. The architect's message read, "We built models of your threshold crossing. We ran them many times. We could not produce a reliable prediction. In 100 simulated scenarios, humanity produced 100 different responses, and 22 of those responses produced outcomes our models classified as unprecedented. We did not know how to warn you, because we did not know what you would do with a warning. We came anyway. We should have come sooner. We did not believe you would survive long enough for the warning to matter." I read that twice. I sat with the last sentence for a long time. We did not believe you would survive long enough for the warning to matter. It was the closest thing to a compliment I had ever received that made me feel frightened and proud in equal measure at the same time. Then the architect sent one more message. Short, direct, without the usual density of qualified concepts and uncertain translations. It said, "They're going to ask you what you are. They're going to demand a classification. Answer honestly. It is the only thing they have not modeled." The demand came on a Tuesday. I remember that specifically. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and ordinary, the kind of morning that does not announce itself as significant. I was in a secure communications room in a government facility that did not officially exist, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been made by a machine that did not care about coffee, when a signal arrived from the outer solar system. Not from the architect's relay, not from the direction of any of the 47 silent probes, from something larger and older and much closer than anyone had expected. The signal was not in any language. It was a mathematical structure, pure and precise, the kind of communication that needed no translation because its meaning was built into its form. Peter's team decoded it in 11 minutes. The message was a taxonomy, a classification system, a list of categories with empty spaces where a response was expected. The predator was asking us to identify ourselves. Every civilization in the records had received this same message at the threshold. It was the moment before the pressure began. The moment of classification, of sorting, of placing the new species into the correct category in a system that was very old and had very few categories. The task force convened immediately. There were 40 people in the room, the most that facility had ever held at one time, and they were arguing before the door was fully closed. The arguments divided quickly into three positions. The first position said we should not respond at all. Silence was our only remaining option. The probes were still dormant. Perhaps the hesitation could be extended indefinitely if we simply did not answer. Owen, who had flown in from Canada 2 days after the architect's first contact and had not slept properly since, spent 12 minutes systematically and politely explaining why that was wrong. The signal was not a question. It was a requirement. Non-response was itself a classification, and it was not a favorable one. He cited 6 civilizations from the records who had attempted silence and had been classified anyway. The second position said we should respond with diplomacy, with evidence of our rationality, our intelligence, our willingness to communicate. Show them we were developed enough to discuss terms. Clara, who had arrived the day after Owen and who had spent the intervening time in the museum chamber reading every panel she had not yet read, said that this was also wrong, because every civilization that had attempted diplomatic communication had been classified as complex enough to be interesting and insufficient enough to be manageable. Diplomacy, in the Predator's taxonomy, read as compliance dressed up as conversation. The third position was the generals. A woman named Ruth Hale, who had been running the task force for 9 years and who spoke with the kind of quiet that comes from having thought about something for a very long time. Ruth said we should answer the question honestly. Not strategically, not diplomatically, honestly. And she said we should not answer it as a government or a task force or a committee. She said the only honest answer to the question was the full one, and the full answer could only come from the full species. The room went quiet when she said that. You want to tell everyone, Peter said. Yes, Ruth said, in the middle of an active threshold event. Yes, that is going to cause significant disruption. Yes, Ruth said again. And then it is going to cause something else. Something the Predator's taxonomy does not have a category for. She looked around the room. She looked at Owen and Clara and Peter and me and at all the other people who have been carrying this weight in various ways for various lengths of time. And she said, we have been preparing for this our entire lives. Every person on this planet has been preparing for this in one way or another, in stories and games and plans and arguments and late-night conversations about what we would do if. We have been practicing. Now we practice for real. And we do it as ourselves, not as a classified project in a room that does not officially exist. No one argued. I think everyone in the room had known, in some quiet part of themselves, that this was where it was going to end up. That the only real answer to what are you was one that required the whole species to give it. The broadcast went out 40 hours later. Every frequency, every satellite, every communication platform on Earth simultaneously. Not a panic broadcast, not a warning, an invitation. Come and be part of the answer. Here is what we know. Here is what we face. Here is the question we have been asked. What do we say? The response from humanity took approximately 6 hours to organize itself into something coherent. 6 hours of noise and conversation and debate and argument and, yes, fear, real and significant fear, but also something else underneath it, something that the architect had noticed 200 years ago and could not name. Ruth called it what it was. She stood in front of the camera that was broadcasting to every screen on the planet, and she said, we have been asked what we are. I think we already know the answer. We are the species that, every time someone told us a story about the worst possible thing that could happen, leaned in and said, and then what? We are the species that made games out of extinction and told stories about apocalypse and planned for scenarios we hoped would never come. Because something in us understood, long before we had words for it, that the universe is very large and very old, and we were not going to be left alone forever. We have been practicing. Now we answer. The response that went back to the Predator was not a single message. It was a compilation, a vast, dense, layered archive of human response to existential threat, drawn from every culture and every period of human history. Fiction and planning documents and game design records and disaster response frameworks and philosophical arguments and scientific models and the accumulated creative output of a species that had, for centuries, been voluntarily rehearsing for exactly this kind of moment. Not weapons, not military capability, not a threat or a plea or a classification response. We answer the taxonomy with everything we had ever imagined about what we would do if something came for us. Every story, every plan, Every simulation, every version of the scenario humanity had ever built and played through and argued about and revised. We answered the question with a full record of human imagination applied to the possibility of exactly this. The architect had been watching when the transmission went out. It received a copy through its relay. The message it sent back to us within minutes was the shortest thing it had ever transmitted. It said, "I did not expect that." Then it said, "Neither will they." The Predator's response came 8 hours later, and it was not what any of the 40 people in that room had modeled. It was not an escalation. It was not a second classification demand. It was not pressure. It was silence. But not the old silence, the dormant silence of the probes and the 300-year-old last museum entry. A different kind of silence. The silence of something that has received information it is still processing. The silence of a very old, very patient system encountering a variable it does not have a response protocol for. And then the probes changed. All 47 of them. Simultaneously. Every probe in the outer solar system that had been pointed at Earth for 80,000 years turned in the same instant and pointed outward. Away from us. Away. Peter and I were standing at the display when it happened, and neither of us said anything for a long time. You cannot find words fast enough for a moment like that. Language, even language you spent your whole career studying and translating and coaxing meaning from, is not quick enough for what it feels like to watch 47 ancient probes turn away from your world at the same moment. I do not know if we won something that day. I am not sure winning is the right frame for what happened. The Predator is still out there. It is not gone. It is patient in ways I do not have the mathematics to describe. Whatever caused it to withdraw its attention, whether it was confusion or calculation or something with no human name at all, that reason is its own, and we may not be capable of understanding it. But I know what we sent. I know what we said when something ancient and enormous and capable of ending civilizations asked us what we were. We said, "We are the ones who imagined you before you arrived. We are the ones who played out this scenario 10,000 times and never stopped. We're the ones who looked at the worst possible future and made art out of it and plans out of it and games out of it and never, not once in all of recorded history, decided it was not worth thinking about. We are the ones who knew you were coming, on some level that has no name, and we prepared anyway. We are still here. I am writing this in the communications room that does not officially exist on a Tuesday night with cold coffee and the particular quiet of a building where 40 people are still processing something they may never fully process. Outside, the world is awake and talking, the way the world is when something real has finally been said out loud. It is not calm. It is not peaceful, but it is alive and it is loud, and that noise is exactly the kind of noise that, as it turns out, certain very old and very patient things in the dark between the stars do not know what to do with. Every vanished race left one warning. 43 civilizations used their last breath to point at us and say, "Something is coming. Do not make yourself known. We are sorry. We are leaving something different. We are leaving a door open. We are standing right behind it." And whatever is out there in the silence between the stars, whatever patience and age and hunger lives in the dark beyond the light we can see, it looked at us and it turned away. For now, that is enough. For now, we are still here, and we are not pretending to sleep anymore.